Stimming. What is stimming, and will your child ever stop doing it? My name is Carrie Woodward. I'm a board-certified behavior analyst, and I've been working in the field of applied behavior analysis, specifically with children and adults with autism, for over 20 years. So this is a word that you hear pop up a lot when you're talking about autistic people, stimming. You're going to also hear it called self-stimulatory behavior. You may hear it called stereotypy. You may hear it referred to as automatic behavior, but they're all describing the same type of behavior. And essentially, these behaviors are those that make up that second part of the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder, which is repetitive or ritualistic behavior or patterns. To fit this category, a behavior has to be something that a person engages in that has no clear functional relevance to them. Asterisk about that. That they do it frequently, that maybe it's hard to interrupt. And this behavior also produces its own reinforcement, so it requires no outside or external social reinforcement in order for it to maintain or continue. This type of behavior is sort of a clinician's red flag that a child has autism, because even though there are other diagnoses that may include self-stimulatory behavior as a part of it, it's really our clear indicator that a child has autism. I'm going to go back to the asterisks real quick, that the behavior, in order to be a stimming behavior or self-stimulatory behavior, that it would have no real functional purpose for the individual. What I will say is that a lot of autistic adults will talk about their stimming behaviors and the purpose that it serves for them. So just because it doesn't appear that there's a functional purpose from the outside perspective doesn't mean that for the individual, that behavior isn't serving a unique purpose, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But we all engage in some level of this self-stimulatory behavior. You may be a person who twiddles a pen between your fingers. Maybe you shake your foot while your legs are crossed. Maybe you even pick at your cuticles or your fingers if you get nervous or you're feeling uncomfortable. So every human engages in some level of automatic or self-stimulatory behavior, so that's not unusual. However, for a lot of autistic people, this self-stimulatory behavior can become difficult to interrupt. It can preoccupy them in such a way that they're not able to look or attend to other things. It can be something where they engage in it at such high rates at the exclusion of more functional and adaptable behaviors that are going to benefit them. So why do autistic people engage in self-stimulatory behavior at higher rates than neurotypical people? Well, there's not actually a ton of research as to the why. What we know is that in order to receive a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, there has to be some presence of repetitive and ritualistic behavior. However, the level and degree that this behavior interferes with daily life varies very drastically from person to person on the spectrum. A lot of autistic adults speak to it feeling like a calming to them. If they're feeling high anxiety, that they may engage in stim behavior in order to calm themselves back down. You also hear some people discuss that when they're in an environment that is overstimulating in one sensory area, so let's say that you're in an area that's very loud or there's a lot of noise happening, that you might engage in self-stimulatory behavior to sort of drown out that external stimulation. So I may hum to myself or sing to myself in order to try to drown out all of this external stimulation in order to calm myself back down. So that's a perspective of an autistic adult who's able to vocalize and communicate about the experience of stimming, which I think is hugely valuable and obviously needs to be a part of every conversation that we have about uniquely autistic traits and characteristics. From a behavioral perspective, when we look at behaviors, we are not looking at the topography of the behavior or what the behavior looks like. We are looking at what is the function of the behavior or what's the purpose that it's serving for the individual. And so when we look at self-stimulatory behavior, they all serve an automatic function. And this just means that the behavior itself is producing its own reinforcement. There doesn't need to be external reinforcement happening. There doesn't need to be social reinforcement occurring in order for the behavior to maintain. Behavior requires reinforcement in order to continue. Behavior that is not accessing reinforcement goes away. So self-stimulatory behavior is an automatic function, meaning that the behavior itself is producing its own reinforcement. One of the things that we do in our field in order to assess the function of behavior is a functional assessment, which also can include what we call a functional analysis. And this really gets to the core of what purpose is the behavior serving for the individual. In a functional analysis, we do what's called an alone condition, where we put a person in a space where they don't have other access to reinforcement, meaning there's not toys around, there aren't any people in there to provide social reinforcement, and we see whether or not the person engages in this behavior. And that sort of gives us our indication that the behavior is automatically maintained, meaning it requires nothing else, no other people. I'm still going to engage in this behavior because the behavior itself is producing its own reinforcement. And the reason that the behavioral perspective is so valuable, in my opinion, is because it's really looking at the why and not just what it looks like. Because stimming behavior can appear very stereotypical. You have people who engage in hand flapping, you have kids who engage in humming or talking to themselves, but it doesn't necessarily mean that those behaviors always serve an automatic function. So you can have one behavior actually serve multiple functions, and that's why a behavioral perspective is so important. Let's say you have a kid who engages in what we call vocal stereotypy, which would be the use of the vocal cords in an automatic way, whether that's humming or talking to yourself, singing songs, or just making sounds that are appealing to the person. If you were observing a student and you notice that the rates of the vocal stereotypy are much higher when he's in a noisy classroom with a lot of auditory stimulation, we might be able to say that the behavior is not necessarily serving an automatic function only, but that it's also helping to serve an escape function, and that the person is trying to escape or avoid all of that auditory stimulation in their environment. So having this perspective allows us to say, what can we do to help this person have a better time in the classroom? Can we give them communication tools to request to go outside or a quieter space? Can we give them headphones so that it can help drown out some of this external noise that's making it uncomfortable for them? Maybe we can even look at how we can adjust the physical environment so that it is a more conducive space for learning. So just looking at a behavior and saying, hey, that's a STEM behavior, it's automatic, we're not going to address it in that way, is really a disservice to the individual. You have to be looking at maybe this one unique behavior topographically serves multiple functions, and how can we address the behavior with these different functions in a way that is best serving the individual. And here's my personal sort of theory as to why autistic people engage in higher rates of self-stimulatory behavior. So what we know about autistic infants is that from a very early age, they have a differentiated eye gaze pattern than neurotypical infants do. They're spending their eye gaze time a lot less on the face. They're looking at people less often. When they're looking at faces, they're looking at not the mouth and the eyes as frequently as a neurotypical baby would. So at a very early age, autistic infants are not spending as much time looking at people's faces than neurotypical infants are. And what this means is that most likely autistic people are a lot less sensitive to the social reinforcers that are being provided by people and people's faces. We know that autistic kids are less sensitive to social reinforcement just based on studying whether we can increase or improve behavior with social reinforcement only. And I'm not really sure, it's sort of the chicken or the egg argument. Are autistic people less sensitive to social reinforcement and therefore look less often at faces? Or is this eye gaze pattern that causes autistic babies to not look at faces as often resulting in being less sensitive to social reinforcement? Lots of research areas that can still be explored, but the end result is the same, which is that autistic people tend to be less reinforced by social reinforcers like the face, eyes, and people. Neurotypical people, on the other hand, spend a lot of time accessing social reinforcement. And so if neurotypical people are sensitive to social reinforcement and are also sensitive to just traditional tangible reinforcers, then our reinforcer pool is a lot bigger than an autistic individual who accesses tangible reinforcement but doesn't necessarily access social reinforcement. So as an individual who has a smaller reinforcement pool, I might engage in behavior that produces its own reinforcement in an effort to seek out reinforcement. So you may be more inclined as an autistic person to sort of develop behaviors that produce their own reinforcement because you're not accessing enough reinforcement from the social environment. And my theory is sort of informed by a variety of different things, but a lot of what this comes from is watching autistic kids learn more functional skills and develop better sensitivity to social reinforcement. And some of this stereotypy or self-stimulatory behavior just sort of naturally decreases on its own without any formalized intervention. So as we build up the ways that a child can access reinforcement through the social environment, we sort of see this natural inverse correlation to rates of self-stimulatory behavior. And one of the questions that I get a lot from parents is my kid ever going to stop stimming? And the answer is no, because everybody engages in some level of self-stimulatory behavior. So it would be inconceivable to think that we would get rates to just go down to zero. There's also a lot of research in the literature that shows that self-stimulatory behavior, it's almost impossible to get it to rates of zero. when you hear autistic adults speaking about self-stimulatory behavior, you also can get the sense that they don't want their stimulatory behavior to go down to rates of 0, right? So we're not interested in getting self-stimulatory behavior to stop or go away. What we are interested is making sure that this self-stimulatory behavior is not interfering with a person's ability to learn in their environment, live functionally, be happy, be successful. So if at any point self-stimulatory behavior is interfering with these things, then we need to take a look at it and decide, how are we going to get this to a place where this is more manageable for the person? And we can do this in a couple of different ways. So when you have a person who engages in a lot of vocal self-stimulatory behavior, just giving them functional vocal language can actually be a really great way to replace the self-stimulatory behavior. If teaching functional communication, teaching the ability to answer questions and engage in conversational skills will actually allow self-stimulatory vocal behavior to sort of decrease on its own. Another way that I have found very successful in addressing self-stimulatory behavior that is interfering with a person's ability to function in their daily life is to work on teaching the appropriate times and places for this behavior to occur. So what we want is to signal when the behavior can happen and when we should maybe not engage in that behavior, or give them an alternative to engage in that's a little bit more appropriate given the situation. So here's an example. Let's say that you have a student who engages in hand flapping behavior. And while they're in class, not only does the hand flapping tend to be distracting to the other students in the class, but it's also distracting to the student himself. When he's engaging in hand flapping, he's looking out of the corner of his eye and looking at his hands and not looking at the teacher, not having a conversation with his friends, not playing, not learning the material from the class. So it's obviously something that we need to address, but how are we going to address it? There are a lot of different strategies, and we've evolved so much in the last 20 years that I've been doing this that there was a time a long time ago when we look at the groundbreaking study in the 80s where Ivar Lovaas used ABA to help children with autism. There was a hand slap as a consequence for engaging in inappropriate behavior, which is essentially a punishment procedure. And we've evolved so much that punishment is not even a thing that we incorporate into ABA programs without having exhausted every positive technique available to us, and only when it's like a dire situation. So when we're looking at self-stimulatory behavior, we're not looking at a dire situation. But what we can do is sort of use visual stimuli to signal when is an appropriate time and when is not an appropriate time. So you have this kid who's engaging in high rates of hand flapping in the class. Then you can say, okay, we're going to start with a very short duration of time, and we're going to use some visual signal that we have to keep our hands quiet for the time being. Maybe that's a red card on the table. Maybe it's a red bracelet on the student's hand or a watch. Something, there's a visual cue there that like, hey, right now is not the best time. And you start with a very short period of time that we know that our child can do successfully. And then you can gradually increase the amount of time that your student is able to sit without engaging in this hand flapping behavior. If the student needs to move their hands, you can always give them an alternative to hold in their hands and fiddle with under the desk, so it's less distracting to themselves and to the other students in the class. So this is looking at not getting rid of the behavior at all, but just trying to teach appropriate places or times to engage in the behavior. You can also teach our kids communication skills like, hey, can I go outside and have a hand flapping break? Be able to request the things that they need in that moment. So the very long-winded answer is that no, we are not going to ever get stimming behavior to go away or to decrease to rates of 0, nor would that be the desire of any behavior analyst or family or autistic person probably. But if self-stimulatory behavior is interfering with your child's ability to access their daily life, then you absolutely want to have a conversation with your ABA supervisor to discuss what are some ways that we can work on addressing this in a way that they're not getting rid of it, but we're just working on giving them an adaptable skill that they can do as a replacement for this behavior that's incredibly interfering. You can also explore things that produce matched stimulation. So a behavior analyst is going to try to address what is the actual source of reinforcement, not just that it's automatic, but like what is the actual source. When you have a kid who engages in vocal stereotypy, it could be hard to determine whether it's the actual feeling in the vocal cords that's producing the reinforcement, or if it's the auditory input in the ears that's producing the reinforcement. So you can play around with some different ways, which is, giving a kid headphones and playing music to see, does that compete with the vocal stereotypy? Is that something that has matched stimulation that will allow them to not engage in the vocal stereotypy for a moment? When you find something that has matched stimulation, what you can do is, before a period of time where you need them to engage in listening behavior, let's say before a lesson, you could allow a time period where they have the headphones on and then they can get access to this reinforcement, so that you sort of satiate the desire for it, allowing the next period of time following that to be a time where they're not as tempted to engage in the vocal stereotype because they're pretty satiated on that auditory input. So match stimulation is another great way to explore whether or not we can provide different sources of reinforcement for the student that are very similar to the sources of reinforcement that their automatic behavior is producing. So there are so many ways that we can help our autistic children to be successful while still continuing to have a repertoire of self-stimulatory behavior that they engage in, but that we've given them tools so that the self-stimulatory behavior does not interfere with their daily life. So if it is interfering with your child's daily life, please be sure to reach out to the BCBA that's managing your child's ABA program. If your child's not in an ABA program, I highly encourage you to seek that out, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to address all the things in your child's repertoire, but you could really say, hey, this is one area of concern for us that we'd really like to address, and we can see about helping and supporting you in the best way possible. So I hope that this video was helpful in understanding a bit more about self-stimulatory behavior, how it fits into our autistic kids' repertoires, and the different ways that we can use to address the self-stimulatory behavior interfering with our child's daily life. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and we look forward to bringing you more value next time.